What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Flamewell Archives. Today, we're going to be covering the history of the fantasy genre. Let's go. Part 1. Ancient History. In its earliest form, fantasy was the myths of old. Egyptian, Roman, and Greek myths that attempted to explain the world in a creative way, with different gods ruling over parts of nature and even certain emotions. Most stories told during this time were told through oral tradition, but we soon found people beginning to write down these epics, one of the earliest being the Epic of Gilgamesh, and later, around the late 8th to early 7th century, Homer's The Odyssey and the Iliad were written. Another notable epic from this time is the Aeneid, a poem written by Virgil. Part 2. Medieval Times. Like the ancient times, religion fueled much of the legends, but in a much different way. In the ancient times, people created myths to explain the creation of the world, but the medieval culture was largely Christian-based, and therefore, much of those stories were rooted in biblical morals and truths. So, instead of telling stories to explain how the world came to be, they instead told stories to teach morals about life. Most of the time, characters in this time had solid and easily identifiable moral grounding. Stories in medieval times were also much like the ancient myths in that most were considered real in their time. We see on many medieval artworks that dragons were considered to be just about as real as the other modern animals, being depicted alongside them. During this time, much of the world was still unexplored, and the world itself was much like many fantasy worlds we adore today. We had knights and castles, conquerors, and large untouched natural landscapes. It was the perfect time to form legends that would last centuries. Much of the Eastern world had also been left unexplored by many Europeans, and those who did venture east came back with many tales of strange beasts and peoples. Legends in that time were a lot more believable. Many of the stories in the medieval era laid the foundations for key aspects of modern fantasy. Wizards, dragons, warriors, and quests, that sort of thing. We had stories like Beowulf, and the Arthurian legends came about. Foundational stories that would provide inspiration for many fantasy authors for centuries. Part 3. Fairytales and Folktales. The time of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment saw a burst of creativity in almost all fields from science to art, and with that the collection of many oral traditions. Before this, most myths and legends had been told orally, with things being added to them each time they were told. But then, along came men like the Brothers Grimm. They compiled stories into anthologies, cementing these folk tales into history, many of which are still loved today. Brothers Grimm can be attributed to stories like Snow White, Hansel and Gretel, and Rumpelstiltskin. Part 4. Gothic and Romantic Fantasies. This era of fantasy paved the way for a lot of modern fantasy with the rise of more long-form stories, that is, the novel, and fantasy with darker and more mysterious tones. Characters in the stories told during this time were tended to be more morally ambiguous. The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole is considered the first Gothic fantasy novel, published in 1764. Edgar Allan Poe was known for his more psychologically intense stories. This era of fantasy told stories that were dark and covered deep and thoughtful themes. This paved the way for modern fantasy in a lot of ways. Though the level of darkness was scaled back quite a bit, it still lingered, and thoughtful themes were still covered for many years to come. Part 5. The Birth of Modern Fantasy. With the Gothic era of fantasy over, most people turned to telling stories that were similar to the folk tales of old. Stories like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll and The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by Frank Baum came out. These stories, about secondary worlds adjacent to our own, had much of the folktale elements and feel, a whimsical feeling, but also were unique in many ways. Eventually, we saw the birth of beloved fantasy worlds such as Middle-earth and Narnia. C.S. Lewis brought us a quirky and fun fantasy world, much akin to those earlier stories like Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland, but with deeply Christian themes like the stories told in the Middle Ages. Tolkien spent his lifetime working on Middle-earth and set a high bar for modern fantasy. Vast worlds with intricate and deep lore. Tolkien's world stands as a mountain in the fantasy genre, with very few fantasy worlds ever coming close to rivaling it. His works cemented the popularity of well-known fantasy races such as elves and dwarves. Part 6. fantasy as we know it. After Tolkien's success, many authors attempted but failed to create worlds as detailed as Middle-earth, mainly because they didn't spend a lifetime developing it as Tolkien did. Though a few standouts did emerge, one of the earliest being Robert Jordan, who wrote the Wheel of Time series. The popular role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons was also developed with heavy inspiration from Tolkien's works, even going as far as including Ents into the game, though due to copyright issues, they had to change the creature's name to Treant. D&D is much loved by many fantasy nerds today, but when it was first developed, it was less mainstream. When Robert Jordan passed, a little-known author, but Wheel of Time fanatic nonetheless, took his place in finishing the series. This author's name is Brandon Sanderson. He later went on to redefine how a lot of magic systems were created. Before Sanderson, many magic systems were soft, with not a lot of rules, but Brandon created magic systems so detailed they were more like sciences. George R.R. Martin, with the still unfinished A Song of Ice and Fire series, brought back the ideas of morally ambiguous characters, and even birthed a new subgenre, grimdark fantasy. After a while, though, fantasy fans became burnt out from all the dark and depressing grimdark books and wanted something a little more laid back. Thus was born cozy fantasy, one of the most popular books in that genre now being Legends and Lattes. Now, the fantasy genre is at its height in popularity, with a broad scope of different subgenres, one of the most popular currently being romantasy, with books like Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros and A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas taking TikTok by storm. But there are a lot more subgenres where that came from. Urban fantasy, sword and sorcery, portal fantasy, just to name a few. If y'all would like, I could make a video in the future about these different subgenres. Fantasy isn't just popular in the book space, we have all sorts of other mediums that are creating fantasy art. It's no secret that fantasy is probably at its peak in popularity currently, and I do hope that popularity keeps going strong. So, that's the history of the fantasy genre, from its earliest beginnings to where it is now. What do you think of the video? Was there anything I didn't mention? How do you feel about the current state of the fantasy genre? Do you like where it's headed? Let me know all this and more in the comments below. If you like this video, why don't you give it a like and subscribe? It would really help the channel. You guys have a good one. Peace.